Hi, I'm Jess Fields. Welcome to the show. This is part two of a two-part interview I did with progressive grassroots activist Alison Greene, a social media influencer who tweets at Grassroots Speak with over 80,000 followers. In this part of the interview, we took a different turn and talked a little bit about quarantine during the coronavirus, as well as what Bernie Sanders has to do with the Russia investigation and several other interesting issues. I think you'll find this to be a very interesting end to the interview with progressive activist Alison Greene. So, Allison, I want to
Mhm.
unpack this a little bit because
Sure.
obviously people, let's say 25, 30 years ago, there was no
Mm.
Twitter. And a person that wanted to be politically involved would either find an organization or they would go and maybe join their, political party in their hometown, go to conventions or, do something like that. Of course, 25, 30 years ago, really, you didn't have much cable news in the sense that it is extant now. Why do you think people, just speaking from the left, but I mean, you can also speak just in general, because obviously a similar phenomenon occurs on the right with regards to there's a pro-Trump and a conservative Twitter, a right-wing Twitter, that similarly to, as you say, takes a kind of on-the-ground view of things and, kind of goes around what maybe the media is reporting widely, and so you have a lot of things that are only beginning really on Twitter and on social media, Facebook, this social media activism. Why do you think political activism moved to social media in the way that it has? I mean, is it because it's decentralized? Is it more effective? Is there a general resistance to the organization of media under certain news outlets? What is the cause of that, you think?
Well, I mean, it's an interesting question because I was actually just looking at the figures. I was trying to, when we were talking about the rent strike, for example, I was thinking to myself that part of the problem is that the cost of living is so much higher than it was 30 years ago. And I started to delve into some of those numbers, and I realized that the the issues that we're dealing with right now, the things that I said I feel like are unsustainable, are things that are problematic now that were not necessarily 30 years ago. So one of the things is that the it's been like a valve. The problems over the last 20 or 30 years have definitely compounded, that we're about to explode, and we need different avenues to do that. But so I think that that's one of the main things there. But then the media is definitely an issue. I was looking into, I just, we have always been a country that is very conscious of truth in advertising. And there's a whole regulatory body, the FTC, that oversees truth in advertising. Right now, we need truth in news. And there's nobody regulating that. And so I think that there are conglomerates like Fox that has led us to question the information that's being presented to us. And alternate um, there are alternate areas of media that it may not be as sensationalist and problematic as I believe Fox Network to be, but it's maybe edited. It's just not getting to us the news that we need to be getting. And I think that the media, um, I'm going to fight tooth and nail to keep the freedom of the press and to talk about the importance of the freedom of the press. But at the same time, the press needs to be a little bit better about stepping up with the stories that they're presenting and making sure that they're catching it all, that they have the safety net and are seeing the things that we need to see and that are presented to us. And with social media, I think we're like the safety net that's catching a lot of the stories that we would be missing if we were just watching the networks.
So, a couple of questions off of that, Allison.
Mhm.
One, of the major, let's say, cable news networks or newspapers, and I'll just put in a plug here for my own show and say that I did an interview with my former journalism professor, Dale Rice, who was a local city reporter at numerous publications. And if someone watches that interview, they'll see that Professor Rice has a strong view that there are still relatively neutral reporters in the world
Mhm.
out there. But I'm asking you, in terms of like cable networks, major newspapers, even websites, do you feel like there are any that are really free of that influence or that bias, as you mentioned? Because you're talking about, if I can try to summarize what you're saying, you're talking about a political bias on the one hand, and you're also talking about, is it fair to say, a corporate bias as well? Are there any outlets that you feel are free of that, that are considered maybe major mainstream news outlets?
I personally don't ever, um, I don't exist, sorry, I don't contain myself to any one network or any one outlet. I'm looking across multiple. And I think that's, to me, that's the healthiest way to do it, because do I think that there is a perfect network out there? No. I know that some people are passionate, for example, about NPR. I personally have not been as involved with them, but I've always found stories from them to be reputable. But I'm not glued to them per se. I'm across multiple things. The Washington Post and the New York Times. I have some articles and some reporters that I love their reporting, and I think that they're presenting something very relevant and presenting it well. And then there are other reporters within that same, Washington Post or New York Times that I'm not crazy about. I think that there's a variety all across the board, and I've yet to find the perfect entity.
I'm sure one of the fair reporters at the New York Times is my former classmate at Texas A&M, Rick Rojas, but who's on the national desk. A plug for
Yes,
Rick, who
I
is
will check out Rick's.
Rick is a
I
very good reporter. But
Yeah,
but in terms of the broader skepticism of, let's say, corporate owned media, because really any large media outlet is owned by a corporation or has a corporation itself.
right.
Is it fair to summarize your position that there are very few corporately owned media outlets on either side of the aisle that are presenting a truly neutral point of view, or would you say no, there are a few that are doing that?
I don't think I would go that far. I mean, I think that when you talk about the two sides of the aisle, I definitely think that one side of the aisle is very, very difficult to be called anything close to neutral. On the other side of the aisle, so to speak, there are some networks that are corporate owned that I do think that there is attempts at neutrality. I don't think they're getting it right across the board, but they're definitely, I can't put Fox in with any other, I'm sorry, with any other network as apples to oranges. So I'll separate it out, and I'll say, of the other corporate media, um, I think that it varies show to show and host to host. And what I'm trying to say is, even my best shows and my best hosts, I believe that maybe sometimes they're a little bit contained by their corporate um, bosses. But that's certainly not to say that I don't believe that they're neutral. I do believe that they're trying to be neutral.
Overall, in the media landscape, I
Mhm.
guess what people would generally call the mainstream media, the large newspapers, national and large city newspapers, the cable networks, the most popular websites. Do you feel there's a bias more in one direction or the other, or is it kind of any particular uh, is there, I guess, is there any particular affect that you feel spreads pretty broadly across the media? Or is it that, it really is up to each and every outlet as to where they kind of come down?
Yeah, I mean, I think there's subtleties to it all as well. I mean, overall, I don't think that there's a particular bias. You know, I'm emphasizing, there are certainly sometimes I see things that I don't like and that I think have a different agenda. But, you know, that bias, if anything, is just, it to me it's not as much a political bias as it's a corporate bias, if that makes sense. I think
So
that's where I'd leave it.
sure. So going back to, I guess, the beginning of this line of questioning, you were
Sure.
talking about the FTC and the regulation of consumer goods,
Mm.
and that there was not a similar mechanism for regulating the media and media outlets. Could you expound on that a little bit and talk about what would be appropriate in your view, as a policy goal to try and either create such a mechanism or use existing mechanisms to do something similar to that?
I mean, I would like to see the FTC expanded out to be beyond advertising. The reality is we should not have gotten to a point where we have a president, and I have not looked it up myself, but I believe we're up to 20,000 lies, and the Washington Post is very good at keeping count of the lies that we're hearing. And I think that that is something that is beyond, and it's disinformation, and disinformation is something that we should have some control over. I mean, I remember way back when you weren't actually allowed to advertise, for example, pharmaceuticals, and the reason being that that should be something that is, provided by your doctor, not based on a commercial. I mean, I think that there has been, in our historically, there have been regulations to say this is beyond what's deemed acceptable. And what is happening with the news outlets, and Fox in particular. And I was very frustrated at the constant showing of the press briefings that were happening, because there was just so much misinformation and disinformation that was dangerous. And so I see it as a security issue. And I don't know if FTC is exactly the vehicle, but what I'm saying is it's shocking to me that we could be monitoring how people are allowed to advertise, and they're not allowed to lie in advertising, to mislead the public to sell their product, yet politicians are able to lie and mislead to sell their political agenda.
So this is certainly interesting to unpack because, of course, um, I, I don't think it's a political comment to say that regardless of what one's political views are, they probably think politicians lie. That's a pretty universal, a pretty a pretty universal sentiment. It Who would be the uh, arbiter, you think, or who ought to be the arbiter of determining, let's say, truth, in political advertising, or
There
truth
should
in?
be an independent counsel on that. Just like, I mean, one of the things that I'm scared for our country is the attack on our judicial appointments and the lack of independence happening there. I mean, we actually should have checks and balances that have independent entities outside of politics to monitor politics. It's, one of the things that I'm very scared we're losing right now, the checks and balances that we're supposed to be having. So, I mean, just like you have with the financial industry, you have an SEC. Whether the SEC is successfully doing its job or not is maybe another question, but it's within the spirit of what I'm talking about. You have an SEC who is there to regulate the financial groups. So I didn't mean to wax poetically about big broad ideas per se, but you know we do need to put the brakes on some of what is happening in our country today. And you know it's not sustainable for us, and it's beyond just, we started this conversation with the rent strike, but what I'm trying to say is there's a lot of bigger problems that if we can't get a handle on our government and our politics that are out of control right now, it's a train wreck.
If a federal agency, let's say, or independent counsel were created at the federal level to regulate, political speech for truthfulness, um, would there be a concern about um, the party or group in control of the government using that to their own ends? Obviously, if Republicans control the White House, the Republican president appoints all of the heads of the agencies. If a Democrat controls the White House, a Democrat president will appoint all the heads of the agencies. I mean, is that something that is relevant here, or do you think the principle is maybe more important than that sort of a detail at this point?
It's relevant, but at the same time, it's one of those things that, I use the FTC in particular because I was trying to make the point that we are already regulating something in a speech kind of way, because this always falls into the possibility of freedom of speech. People can say what they want and all of that. And so that was why I was using that as kind of an example. I don't think that we can shy away from it. And, I mean, personally, the root of all evil, is what I think that we're almost kind of talking about. And to be honest, Citizens United and taking money and lobbying out of politics would allow an independent counsel to be independent, just like it would solve a lot of our problems today. So, I don't think that I'm of the approach that you can, you know, just solve all of this with one solution. They're all intertwined. And, really at the end of the day, Citizens United and the lobbying and the money in politics and the corrupting of opinions for corporate gain, for example, yes, that has the possibility of influencing an independent counsel on what I was talking about, just like it has the ability and is kind of really influencing things right now. So, yeah, we've got bigger problems before we can make it a reality. But hopefully, when we start to tackle those problems, we'll also be looking at, I just think that you cannot call yourself a news outlet when you are clearly there to serve a political agenda for one particular party. I don't think that is fair on the American people to wrap it up and call it news.
Regardless of specific policy, obviously, and where we got on this discussion is
Sure.
the fact that, regardless of what the policy is now, you and a number of individuals on both the left and the right have taken to social media for political activism as a way to circumvent what varying perspectives believe is an unfair media environment, or is not covering stories correctly or properly, or not covering all of the news. And so then maybe getting a little bit more into where you are right now, because
Mhm.
you live in West Manhattan, and obviously you are at, in some respects, the center of the universe on the coronavirus crisis that our nation has been going through. I guess if somebody is watching this, in 5 or 10 years, or in a time capsule, we're in the middle of a pandemic, folks,
Yes.
and New York is in the middle of the pandemic, and Manhattan is right there. So, what is the reality on the ground as you've experienced it? What are I guess, what's the daily life for somebody that lives in Manhattan right now? And what's the ups and the downs and I imagine more ups than downs right now.
So it's interesting you ask me that. Because yes, I'm literally I'm on the Upper West Side, but I'm like one block over. It's like Trump Tower and then walk towards the water. I'm in the heart of Manhattan. And my own personal experience is that when I lost my job, I lost my health care.
Mm.
So it's interesting that you bring this up now because I only managed to get healthcare again from May 1st. So for the entire month of April, I did not leave my apartment.
Oh, wow. And
Well, I did not leave my building. I went
well,
down for mail.
and I want to clarify because it occurred to me, I may have said on accident, there's more ups than downs. What I meant to say is there's more downs than ups. It would seem like
Yeah.
it's a very dire situation for most people in Manhattan, but you lost your health care
So
directly.
I was not going to walk outside. That was
No, absolutely.
basically what I actually, so I'm actually in the heart of it, but I'm not necessarily one who can give a worldview because I've literally not left my apartment for all of April. I left this morning for the first time because I just got health insurance. And what I did see, I had specifically chose early morning to go out for my first walk in over 30 days. And I actually did see that I would say 9 out of 10 people did have masks. I did specifically go to a very unoccupied area because what my experience was, and prior to not leaving my apartment for all of April, the couple times I was out in March, I found it very scary. I'm by the water, so there's a walking path. And I went to the walking path and I had, somebody on a bike come up behind me and cough as she passed me. And I thought, I can't control the people who are around me, and it was hard to stay 6 feet away from people because you're on a narrow walking path and they're coming at you and there's nowhere to go because you have traffic on either side. So then I stopped going down to the walking path and I went to a Duane Reade, which is a local pharmacy. And I would find that you go around a corner to another aisle and you're like bumping into somebody who doesn't have a mask. And so it was still early days. I happened to be 2 blocks from Mount Sinai West, which is a very prominent hospital here. So, there were hospital workers who were in line for for Duane Reade at the pharmacy without masks, and you're just very conscious. I commend them as heroes, but they're also in a very vulnerable environment. And so I really had, at that point, without health insurance, had to decide that I was going to stay in. So, but what I have seen on social media, the pictures that I've seen in the last couple of days of the park, and speaking to friends who have been out walking the dogs, for example, in the parks are very crowded. And I'm very scared
Mm.
that we won't see the impact of all of these people outside without masks for another 2 weeks. And I feel like our numbers in New York are coming down, but with the nice weather, everybody feels like the numbers have gone down, they're free. And I just don't know if I want to wait it out and see where we're at 10 days to see if we're going to have another outcome where it starts going back up or not. I am concerned for that. Um,
So where I live, I'm fortunate that we have more space. I'm not in Manhattan, and I mean there are very few places like Manhattan. If somebody is listening to watching this and they haven't been to Manhattan, it's pretty crowded, and it is difficult to go anywhere without running into people.
yeah.
Unless you go to like the cloisters, which is amazing. Plug for the
Oh,
cloisters.
gorgeous.
Uh, you know, but
But I'd have to get there by the subway.
by the subway. It's a very long
Yes.
subway ride too, to get there. So, I mean, but if you are, deciding, okay, you're going to hunker down, how did you do that? Did you go buy, I mean, 30 days of food? Did you have everything
Yeah,
delivered? What, I mean, how do you live,
that's a good,
in that
yeah.
place?
So let me give you a brief outline. I actually live in a beautiful apartment, and I'm very lucky that I have large windows. So it's a whole wall of windows. So I feel very much like I have space because I'm not contained by four walls, so to speak. But I'm in about 600 to 650 square feet, and my sister-in-law asked, do you keep the windows open? And I said, singular. There's one window, and because of New York code, it opens about an inch and a half, which is a child guard. So I have
An
one
inch and a
window.
half? That's it?
It might be 3 inches. I might be prone to
Oh my
exaggeration.
goodness.
it's
But
it
it barely
opens a
opens. You have
crack,
one in window that
and
barely opens.
every day my one window is open. I They have set up a good system here where it's um, I actually can send my shopping list to my local supermarket, and they set it up that they have a personal shopper who is somebody who is putting themselves at risk to be in the grocery store and shop. They then bring it to my building, which is only about 2 blocks away, and they drop it off downstairs. And then the people from downstairs bring my groceries up to my door, ring the doorbell. And I usually catch it where I open up the door and the person's around the corner at the elevator, and I actually say, thank you, be safe. But I have my groceries sitting right outside of my door, and I unpack them and wash my hands a whole lot.
Yeah,
And
so as you say, do
that's
you, I mean,
life.
do you scrub the groceries down when they come to your door, or
I don't do that as well. There are some instructions that some people do that. I haven't been doing that as much, but I try to only unpack the perishables, and then usually like don't touch them for a couple of days, so that I'm figuring, it's not an immediate need, and
the
I'm
virus
not,
is dead
the
by
virus is
then?
going to be
Yeah.
gone by then, kind of
Oh my
thing.
goodness.
I don't know if it works that way, but that's how I personally. So that's a little snapshot. 600 square feet, one window, your groceries delivered, and an addiction to Netflix. And
Right,
reading the news is really
right.
what is my pandemic world right now.
Sure.
And I do talk to people who go for walks on beaches and outside, and I think that's really nice. But we're in a dense city in New York City, and I just
Right.
can't do it.
So I mean, in terms of just average person in New York, obviously, a lot of people that live in Manhattan
Yeah.
in the city like you do. I mean, if you live in the city, are people just mostly staying put for this long period like you are, or is it kind of half and half? Or, I mean, you mentioned the park. There are stories that there are a lot of people out in the parks now.
Yeah.
Obviously, maybe a few weeks ago that wasn't the case, but I mean, how many people have actually hunkered down for a long period of time as you have?
Well, we actually started to see a shift, I would say early March, where New York, especially in my area, kind of what I would consider cleared out. And what it is that, especially where I live, I actually live on a street that I'm not on the right end of it, but it's called Billionaire Row. And there are a number of very wealthy. So the buildings surrounding me, there was definitely a feeling that people had gone to their beach houses in the Hamptons. And it felt like,
Right. That would be
yeah,
that would be the
so
that'd be the place to be. Go to the Hamptons instead of maybe being
well,
in Manhattan.
and we have very high rates going on in Long Island because a lot of the people in New York City migrated out around March
Wow.
to the outer Long Island so that they would have more space. So, we're hunkered down, those of us who didn't go to our second homes. And again, this is another reason for our rent strike, is that, you know, the virus and how we're actually impacted by it is very different when you have a beach house in the Hamptons to go to. And not everybody, I mean, I'm luxurious that I have somebody who's doing the shopping for me. We've got a whole bunch, but then there's somebody else who's on, in their second home, and not confined to a smaller apartment, but has a yard and can go for walks and do that. So I would say that the city started to empty out at one point, and then those who were sticking around were sticking around.
So, in terms of like your, I guess, reintegration plan, obviously,
Yeah.
New York is now starting. I mean, Governor Cuomo has said that he is starting to slowly reopen the state. So when do you plan to get back out into society?
I'm really doing that a little bit with my walks now that I have my health insurance, but I think that June we'll start to see that we can migrate out. But
Still a
we're
month away, then,
watching.
basically.
Yeah, I mean, technically, our stay-at-home order is through the 15th, I believe, is still the latest. Um, but then it's going to be in phases. So I think we'll know more. And I think that even now, with seeing what's happening in the parks, I don't know if we'll get to May 15th or if the numbers will start to spike again, is my concern. And then the stay-at-home order will be expanded out, because what the rest of the country may not realize is the issues with the density of New York City. We just, it's just too hard with everybody living on top of each other. I go out, I explained to, my parents that there's talk that droplets can stay in the air for 6 hours or even longer. And so I say, every time I walk out into my apartment building hallway, anybody who's been sick in my hallway, 6 hours before, we're just on top of each other. It's very hard to contain. So I expect that we'll probably be May 15th, we might start, but I'm not really, I'm going to be conservative, and I'm going to say I expect that June we might be getting out, and then fall we might be back in again.
So how do you feel overall the health system has functioned in New York? Because obviously, for everyone that's not in New York, you can only read the stories of the overwhelmed hospitals, the morgues, the nonprofit organizations that come in to help, things like that. I mean, overall, has it functioned relatively well, or is it just
you know there's two different levels to that. So first of all, let me just say the people have been fabulous, and one of the things that I look forward to is I go to my 3 inches of my open window every night at 7 o'clock because we're clapping, and the people have been
really
wonderful every night. I can
at
send you
7 o'clock?
videos. 7 o'clock
Why is that?
every night. We started it a while ago. I mean, I probably have been doing it for about 30 days at least. And we have 800 units. I look upon a courtyard, and we're all out there at 7 o'clock for about 1 or 2 minutes clapping for our healthcare workers.
Hmm.
And we don't know if they hear us or not, but I think it is happening all around New York City as well, because we're so proud of the people.
Hmm.
What failed us a little bit is the national support for equipment, and the supply chain really failed us. But that's not to do with our system. I think that our hospitals, everybody kind of stepped up, is the impression I get. But at the same time, we were not prepared, as nobody would be, that we should have that much PPE, because we didn't know that there was going to be such a contagious. And the hardest thing was the failure by the national, the federal response to helping us get PPE was the biggest problem that we faced during everything. But we've been impressed with our local leadership. I think many of us, I personally think Governor Cuomo, his press briefings every day I value as a resource for information, and it's been incredible. So there's that. And I think that the individual doctors, nurses, they really, really stepped up to what was like warlike environments in a way that I just can never express our thanks for. So I think that, that was really good.
What is the hardest part of this for you? I mean, on a personal level, away from the politics, what has been the most difficult thing about this crisis?
And you want me to separate it from the politics? It's hard to do. Um,
It can be tied in if it, I mean, I just, I could tell that it
yeah,
seems like a very personal topic to you when you talk about the healthcare workers and clapping at 7 and
yes.
these sorts of things. I mean, what has been the most profoundly difficult aspect of this for you personally? And maybe what's been a positive? It sounds like that clapping moment every night has been a positive.
It has been. I think the two sides of the coin, then I would say, is the most personal thing has been the heartbreak with watching, I mean, the you can't get your head around the fact that we have, I think it's 68,000 at this point, deaths around the country, and the people who stepped up in personal circumstances and worked for the rest of us. My heart breaks for them, but at the same time, I'm so awe-inspired by them. And I saw a great little video the other day, which was kind of done in a very fairy tale-esque kind of way, of a father talking to his son and talking about the story of the virus, and that back in the day there was this great virus, and it became the great realization that what had come before the virus was not good, and the virus took us to a place where we came out of this and were able to appreciate things more. I think that there's that hope that this will turn things around in a positive way, and that we might come out of this stronger, just like we have in other situations. So there's the heartbreak on the one side and the hope on the other side. I think that is the hardest thing for me, is grappling with each.
Do you know anybody that's gotten coronavirus in New York? Anybody that's, become seriously ill or even died from it?
So I actually don't know of anybody who's died myself, but I have colleagues, and then we'll hear, a friend of a friend kind of thing.
Mhm.
Yeah.
Yeah. It
Um,
probably would be
so
difficult
I've
not to be
been,
touched by it being in
yeah,
Manhattan, yeah.
I've been very lucky in that sense. Most of my family is outside of New York. So it's really been more colleagues who have gotten sick but have recovered. And that's the one thing, is there are more people that I know of who have recovered, luckily. So, yeah.
Well, I want to shift a little away from coronavirus and talk about um, we were started with strikes, sort of, and I want to kind of come back around to strikes because you have a strike concept that you are promoting yourself, which is certainly interesting. Which you're calling, I think, if I could be fair on the name of it, like the federal tax strike. What is that about?
Yeah, so that's a concept that I kind of developed around 2018, and I've tried to get it off the ground a little bit, but it's a very ambitious thing. But it's very much actually in our stream of consciousness, right? Like, it's very much a relevant thing at the moment. And what that was that I was very aware from around 2018, some research that I was doing about the donor states and the dependent states. And we are starting to hear a lot more about, I think they're calling them the takers and the givers at the moment, because of, Mitch McConnell has talked about that certain states should just declare bankruptcy, and Governor Cuomo has said, well, we give a lot more money. And so what I actually found interesting was, when I looked at it in 2018, the figures I had was that you had a state like Kentucky, in 2015, it required 11.7 billion, I believe it was, in excess funds from the federal government to run its state. At that time, New York State actually gave an excess of $41 billion to the federal government. So, in other words, when all of the New York residents paid their federal taxes, there was 41 billion left over for the overall pot that was distributed to states like Kentucky. And so I was really looking at it and thought, I personally politically feel that a lot of the actions of certain representatives of certain states, and I'll talk out loud here and I'll say Mitch McConnell, I believe he's been holding legislation hostage for a very long time now. And he's been doing judicial appointments and withheld votes on judicial appointments prior to Trump coming in, for example. He has exerted an extreme amount of power, and yet he's actually dependent on other states that were powerless, such as New York. So I was advocating at that time, look, if we're not going to get the federal government behaving in a way that is constitutional and with the appropriate checks and balances, if a president is suddenly above the law, for example, and things like that, I don't know that we want to be contributing to the federal pot. And COVID was a very interesting example where here we are, a donor state who was, giving and giving and giving to the federal government. And then when we're in need, we as a state are being starved from federal funds. And it's exactly what I was worried about. So I had an idea where I said, you know what? It actually is legal for us to withhold our federal taxes until the following tax day. When you're paid a paycheck, you can actually choose to withhold your federal taxes, or you can choose to have no federal taxes withheld. So I thought about a way of actually organizing the donor states to pass some state legislation where they would set up an escrow account, and we would pool our federal taxes but not give it over to the federal government until we got a little bit more of a voice in the overall process. So I was looking at a federal tax strike for the last year and a half. And now with what's happening with COVID, I'm still an advocate of the fact that, the age old statement is no taxation without representation. And I'm going back to that.
So obviously, Governor Cuomo certainly has echoed sentiment about the state kind of pushing back against the federal government in some of what he has said. But I'm curious, as far as the maybe the why on that. You mentioned Kentucky and New York specifically. According to the census, the household income in New York, I suppose, average from 2014 to 2018, median household income is 60,762. In Kentucky, 48,392. So substantially less, and maybe there could be numerous reasons for that. One potential reason is that maybe Kentucky is a poorer state than New York. So um, uh, is that something that could explain the disparity, or do you think there's other reasons maybe for that disparity, political reasons, et cetera?
No, actually, I think that the disparity is also, there's two factors here. There's the population of Kentucky versus the population of New York, for example. And as I mentioned before, that all of the blocks around me, a lot of those people went out to the Hamptons. I assure you, they are not making an average of 60,000. We actually have, New York and California are somewhat unique in that a large portion of the 1%, New York, California, Seattle, are all residing in those states. So when I talk about the federal taxes that are being paid by somebody like New York versus a Kentucky, the reason why there's so many more taxes is definitely because, you know, I mentioned wealth inequality, but the reality is the wealth is in these coastal cities that are actually right now, ironically, being hit hardest by COVID. And so, you know, we actually have way more people, and we have much higher fluctuations in incomes, and it actually meant that at the end of the day, and the other thing is that we're not reliant as much on federal funding. So one of the things, when I mentioned the 41 billion in excess from New York versus the 11.7 billion from Kentucky, now that was 3 years ago, and it's changed a little bit. It's now 26 billion instead of 41 billion, which is actually a big difference. But the reason being is that that's actually saying, after we've collected all of our federal money that we're entitled to as a state, there's 41 billion left over. That's how I understood it. And I'm not an economist, but I think that's a little bit more explaining the disparity of why Kentucky and New York are different. But the reality is that New York is a wealthier state, and so it's frustrating to us that when we most desperately need the income for our state in the middle of a global pandemic, it's being denied to us. We're reliant on them passing something in the Senate, and you know, Mitch McConnell has said, let them go bankrupt. And we've never said to him, let them go bankrupt in Kentucky for the last 11 years or whatever that we've been carrying them.
So, Allison, as we maybe start to wind this down, you've been very generous with your time. I kind of want to shift a little bit to obviously this is an election year, and there is certainly a little bit of disparity between the grassroots respectively on the left and the right, and then the respective parties. There seems to be a little bit of difference, a little bit of distance there. As far as so obviously we're not dealing with the right, we're dealing with progressives and with the left, and then maybe the Democratic Party. But with regards to the Democratic nomination, the apparent nominee, Joe Biden, do you feel like he will be embraced by progressives and the left, folks like yourself, some of those Twitter influencers that you mentioned, or will he be viewed with a little more skepticism? Or what's just the overall view about Vice President Biden in this race going forward?
I mean, I think that the reality is that we are in an election year where it's not so much that we're supporting our candidate as much as we are so scared and terrified of what the other candidate would do. So first and foremost, it's vote blue no matter who, because we're really concerned about some really significant issues on the other side. And I think we can all unite behind that. We talk about progressives, and that's such an interesting word to me because I mentioned at the beginning, and we've come full circle in a way, but having lived in Australia, it was not so progressive that I was not going to go bankrupt for my for my health insurance, for a medical situation. That to me is not the height of progressiveness. We're actually the last nation, we're the last nation not embracing that. Do I think we might be a little bit slower to get to the universal health care? Yes, we may be, but at the same time, I can only relate it, actually, I'll relate it if I can to my own personal experience. Having just lost my income, I was offered from my employer that I could get COBRA and I could continue on my current healthcare plan that I had with work. And I then got the paperwork, and it was $813 per month to continue my health insurance. And I really got scared because there's no income coming in, and $813 a month. I don't know. Some people around the country, that might be what they pay for rent. And here it was for health insurance.
So Cobra, just so for people that maybe are not familiar, but Cobra
Oh,
is
yeah,
is a federal program that allows for or regulation that allows for an individual who has been laid off, terminated for approved reasons to continue the health care under the employer for a period of time. I think it's something like a year. But the employee who is laid off, terminated, has to cover the entire cost of the health care that maybe was formerly subsidized or paid in part by the employer. Does that sound like an
correct. So, and we are one of the last, I mean, I'll hesitate to say it, but we may actually be the only nation where your health care comes through your employment, which is, in my mind, a problem as well. But so my employer was paying 100% of my health insurance, and they said, okay, now that you're not employed with us, you get the opportunity to pay for it yourself. And it was $813. Now, New York has a marketplace under the ACA, or the Affordable Care Act. And so I didn't really know much about it. I hadn't had experience. So I went and made a couple of phone calls, and I saw a commercial for Metro Plus New York. I'll give them a plug here. And I called up and I said, this is the situation I'm in. Can you provide me with health care? And they could. And the only difference was going to be that I was not going to be able to go to my same doctor. Well, I nearly died when I heard the price. It's $40.70 a month compared to $813 a month. And I will pay $40.70 and go through the 80 doctors that they have offered me to find one I like, as opposed to staying with a doctor that I knew but didn't know that well for $813. And I just said, is this what everybody's complaining about with Affordable Care Act? They have set up a marketplace where I'm paying $40.70 to get the same kind of coverage, just a different doctor, than I would have gotten for $813. So
There
I,
is, I
yeah,
mean, there is a usually a subsidy with marketplace plans. I mean, it's not, the coverage is not just $40. Obviously, there is some
there
subsidy.
is a government subsidy, but that's so going back to what you said, if Joe Biden comes with with a plan that is going to mean that instead of paying 813, I'm paying $40.70, and it's subsidized by the government, and we haven't gotten to universal health care yet, I'm okay with that. And I think a lot of other people will be okay with that too. So even though it's not the perfect pill, so to speak, and that, progressives, I was not completely in favor, and with some of the progressive policies that were being talked about, I wasn't necessarily a fan of any one candidate with everything they were saying. I think it's more about finding a way out of where we are right now. And I think Joe Biden will unite us and lead us to do that.
Do you feel that there are individuals on the left, though, who maybe were for one of the more progressive candidates that, just regardless of the fact of what you just said and the desire to unite, do you think that there are people that are going to persist in maybe not supporting the vice president? Or
You've gone into an area that is near and dear to me and is maybe not going to go in the direction that you expected it to. Um, so I actually was using it to prop up my computer here, for example, and it's going to be a little bit hard with, I don't know if you can see.
so you had pulled the stack of papers a moment ago, this cut out, but
Sorry about that.
no, no, no. You were going to answer this question. So the question was, obviously, could you talk about maybe individuals on the left who are going to continue to not support the vice president, as the Democratic nominee. You pulled out, for those who are listening to the podcast, the report on the 2016 election, the Russian influence. Where is that report from, by the way? I couldn't see that.
So I actually just printed it out from the Department of Justice website. So it's actually my printed version with highlights,
That's the
and
DOJ
that's
report.
the
Is that
DOJ.
the Mueller report, or
Yes, it's
yes?
the
Okay,
Mueller report.
okay.
Yep.
So you got the Mueller report, and
And
so
it does relate to your question.
okay, sure, yeah. As far as individuals who are on the left, who are and there are, I think, individuals on the left who are saying that Joe Biden is not representative of them. I'm sure you obviously interact with some of these individuals on Twitter and so forth, and just talk a little bit about that and what that is about, and I mean how prominent you think that is too, because it's difficult to gauge how prominent that is.
It actually ties back to what we talked about a little bit before as well, because I think it's something that the media doesn't report on well enough. The Mueller report, volume 1, there is a quote where it's related to the Internet Research Agency, which is the Russian influence campaign that was doing the disinformation campaign that Mueller, refers to extensively in the report. And the quote from the Russians are, "We support Trump and we support Bernie Sanders." And oh, you didn't know that? You weren't aware of that?
Well, no, I mean, that's a very interesting. So you're bringing up the notion. I guess I would like for you to explain that. So you're bringing up the idea that the Russian influence was propping up both uh, uh, President Trump as well as Senator Sanders.
Correct.
Yeah. Could you
And what
expound
I
on that?
believe, yeah. So just like when Mueller testified, he said that the Russians were going to continue to be, you know, influencing and trying to interfere with our elections. And I think they're using the same playbook. And what it is that they chose a candidate from the left to build up with the intention that that person could not win against Trump. And so some of the people who are passionately within that camp, there's just historically a record that shows that they actually were specifically trying to get Bernie Sanders people so riled up that they would either refuse to go to the polls, and so they would not be voting for Biden, so it pulls away from Joe Biden's ability to win. Or they would even go, and there is records of like 20, I don't know the exact number, but I think it's around the 20 to 26% of people who were Bernie supporters actually voted for Trump. So as part of the Russian influence campaign, they specifically refer in the report to the fact that we support Bernie. And so when you ask me about the fact that some people from the progressive side may actually be reluctant to back the vice president, I'm concerned because that's exactly what Russia was intending, was working on, and continues to work on. And that's the outcome that they're expecting. And so I know that there are passionate Bernie supporters who were not influenced by Russia. And I hope that they will absolutely see that in order to make the changes we need to make, we need to unite to work to get Trump out of the office, which means a vote for Biden. But yeah, this is something that is part of the interference that we have been warned about by the intelligence communities, happened in 2016 and is happening again as we speak, and is maybe not being covered the way it should be in the media, in my opinion.
So,
So yeah.
do you believe that Senator Sanders is aware of this, or?
It's interesting that you say that, because that is what people often jump to. Is he aware of it? Yes, he's made statements about it. And he's said Yes, they may have been helping me, but what can I do about it, so to speak? So, no, I'm not saying that he's participating. I mean, I can't say that. I can't not say that. I'm not electing to comment on whether he's participating. He has the same knowledge that we all have. It's in the Mueller report that they are saying that they were absolutely working for Bernie Sanders. And I'm happy if you wanted to post in the notes. I want to say it was like page 26 or something. But oh, here we go. Page 23. Main idea: use any opportunity to criticize Hillary Clinton and the rest, except Sanders and Trump. We support them. So this has been what they used in 2016. There is Russian influence on promoting Trump, and there's Russian influence on promoting Bernie. And Bernie is as aware of that as anybody else, because it's on the DOJ website, page 23, volume 1 of the Mueller report.
Are his supporters aware of this claim that you bring from the report?
I don't know that all of the supporters are. What we have noticed on social media, I say this with confidence because I think a number of other people have also commented on it. When we post about Bernie Sanders in anything other than a positive way, you get so many reactions that it doesn't feel real. I'll leave it there. It's the well, no, I'll go out to say there. It feels like there's so many bots and trolls descending upon you that it's really hard to decipher who are the actual Bernie supporters and who might be, bots and trolls.
But in the 2016 Democratic presidential nomination, it was widely reported that the Clinton campaign did obviously work in some respects not to the favor of the Sanders campaign. I mean, is that something that you accept, or would you dispute that? Or
I think this goes back to our original conversation about the media. And
right?
I would say that it was highlighted significantly more than how the Sanders campaign might have been working with Hillary. So
Okay.
in other words, it's not to say that that
The story that
was
was blown up is what you're saying. So
just like Trump was not necessarily investigated. It was being investigated while Hillary was being investigated, but the Trump investigation was not public, that Hillary was. Those types of things were occurring and is part of what influenced public opinion.
so back to this question then, do you believe that there are many on the left that won't support Vice President Biden?
I really believe that we're going to see as many united as we can, but I do believe that there will be people who are subject to feeling like, if you're against Bernie, I'm out, and they will jump out of the equation. We had that in 2016. And I think that it's undeniable that it will happen again, but I hope that we've been able to mitigate it so that it won't happen as much. And I think that it would be helpful if the media was actually, you kind of, people who were listening on the podcast couldn't see, you were a little bit surprised, I think, when I brought up some of my Mueller points, because I just don't think it gets talked about.
Well,
And
I just
yeah.
to be clear, I don't know if they saw that because you were the one speaking, and this kind of bounces back and forth on the
Gotcha.
video.
Yeah.
However, I think my surprise was that it is a point that is not often brought up. So
Right.
certainly to bring that up, you know, it highlights a concern maybe among progressives that I don't see being talked about very much. This
That's my
concern that
concern.
you're bringing up, and do you and so on that point, do you believe that many progressive social media influencers, political activists, do you think there's many progressives that recognize this same point that you're bringing up about Bernie Sanders and Russian interference, or do they ignore it, dismiss it, or what has been your response? Because I'm assuming you
On
have talked about this on Twitter.
Yes, and on social media, I've found many people who know about the Bernie issues and talk about the Bernie issues and have said a number of times that we're almost afraid to bring up the Bernie issues because we get attacked so much.
Mhm.
So, I mean, my point being that, when you ask the question of, will some progressives be dropped out, will be dropping out and not voting for Joe Biden, I understand the anger and I understand it. And I think that if we were actually talking about some of this and addressing it head on, there may be a little bit more understanding of where some of where some of that passion is being flamed from, like they're fanning the flames. And when that's kind of understood, I think that it could actually help the situation. But I think that this is something that people are very trepidatious about speaking about.
So who was your preferred? I mean, now that the nomination is settled, it seems, who was your preferred candidate, if not Senator Sanders?
Oh, yeah. I mean, I was adamantly not going to be with Sanders, and it was a toss up between a couple of people. We were pretty far away from it in New York, so I was waiting to see how it panned out. I've been a fan of pieces of many of them. I would have happily voted for Elizabeth Warren, but at the same time, when I felt that she didn't have the momentum behind her, the most important thing for me was to vote blue no matter who. So it was very important to see who could get the party behind them the most. If it was going to be Pete Buttigieg, I was going to be, with Mayor Pete. If it was Elizabeth, I was going to be with Elizabeth, because I think that at this point, they all had things of substance that they could bring to the table, just like Joe Biden. But what was more important was that we could all unite behind them. And that was the thing that was hard about Bernie, is it actually had the reverse effect. There were too many people who could come behind Joe Biden, but would absolutely not be able to cast their vote for Bernie. So it was kind of tricky there. He had a passionate following, but he couldn't get everybody behind him.
So in terms of I mean, the Twitter handle you have is grassroots speak, obviously.
Yes.
And but you're saying vote blue no matter who. So, blue meaning the Democratic Party. And obviously there is a relationship and a difference between just the grassroots on the left and then the party. I mean, could you describe that relationship? Is it now something where the grassroots are uniting behind the Democratic Party, or is there a clear distinction that you make, for example, when you're tweeting, when you're talking about these issues? I mean, do you level a lot of criticism at Democrats, for example, or how does that relationship operate?
I do actually give some criticism to Democrats as well. I consider myself more as somebody who is opposing the current administration than being behind a party. And I believe that when I say vote blue no matter who, that there are some people who are either independent or Republicans who have been converted who will adopt that and come to the blue side. And it's not about, to me, it's not about Republicans versus Democrats. It's about right versus wrong. And blue happens to be the capsule that I think is standing for what's right in this case. And I think it embraces a bigger, group than the other side. And I think that was what was important, is that the commonality of what we want to achieve, even if the exact policy isn't the same, the overall objective, and doing what's right, and ensuring that we don't have kids in cages, and ensuring that the wealthy have to pay taxes, and ensuring that children aren't scared to go to school, um, and the safety of children, and ensuring that in a global pandemic, people are taken care of. I think that falls into a container that, in this case, I'm considering blue. But I would say that media and strategy wise, the Democratic Party has not necessarily performed up against the other side, and sometimes they're just not vocal enough. So yeah, I'm not a diehard per se. I have my opinions.
Yeah, and so as we do kind of wind this down, and I want to, you've
Mhm.
been generous with your time, but somebody that's watching this, if they are conservative or maybe they're a centrist or independent, they have some disagreements with you or many disagreements with you, and some of them will be watching, listening to this. Where is the bridge between you and those perspectives, or is there a bridge? Would you urge them to join your side of things, or would you say there is a place of compromise or things that you would agree with them on? Or I guess, what is your relationship, and maybe many progressives, I'm not going to have you speak for all progressives, but where do you feel that grassroots progressives maybe have some common ground with other perspectives, or don't, as the case may be?
I think it's the injustices that we're seeing in the world. I personally believe it's the wealth inequality. I personally feel like there are people all over the country, and I think of like the meat packing places in the middle of the country where people are having to go in and potentially die for their paycheck. And all of these injustices that we're seeing, and some of the inequality, I don't think that you have to call yourself democratic per se. I think that the commonality is that we are both looking for a change, and a change in a positive way, not the kind of change that we saw happen in 2016. So I think it's more about emphasizing the commonality in that, because if you know I just am concerned for our future under this administration. And that's all I think you have to do to have something in common with me and for us to cast the same vote.
So what would you maybe want to say just in general, or speak to maybe your own followers who have gone with us on this long journey, but there's been a lot of topics that we have covered. I mean, what would be your parting message or thing that you'd want to maybe make sure is expressed?
I think that I chose the name Grassroots Speak because I want us to have a voice. And I think the biggest thing is that we, the people, have lost our voice, but I'm hopeful, and I believe that we can keep fighting to keep raising it. And it's exhausting, and it feels as though it's falling on deaf corporate ears, but we need to continue, because I really believe that we need to solve some of this, which often stems from the wealth inequality that's going on in our country. And if we are united in trying to demand change, I think we'll get there. So I do try and be hopeful that we can change this path we're on, because I think many of us are scared about the path we're on.
Alison Greene, progressive political activist in New York City, Twitter influencer, and thank you for joining us and talking about the rent strike and coronavirus and many other things. Really appreciate it.
Jess, it was a pleasure. Thank you so much for having me, and
Thank you.
and I really enjoyed speaking with you.
Thank you so much. And that was the second part of my two-part interview with progressive activist Alison Greene. Remember, if you like this program, please subscribe on YouTube or in your favorite podcast app. If you have an idea for a guest, email me at jessfieldshow@gmail.com. Thanks for listening.